Los Santos, a city of dreams, a place where the sun always shines and the opportunities seem endless. But beneath the glossy surface, a different story was unfolding. For years, the gap between the haves and the have-nots had grown into a vast chasm. The gleaming skyscrapers of downtown cast long shadows over the struggling neighborhoods of South Los Santos. While billionaires cruised in their supercars, ordinary families worried about making rent. The system felt rigged, a game played by the powerful where the average citizen always lost. The city was a powder keg of frustration, just waiting for a spark. The problems were everywhere you looked. Rent prices were skyrocketing, pushing longtime residents out of their homes. Public transportation was a mess, expensive and unreliable for those who depended on it most. The police force, the LSPD, seemed more interested in protecting the interests of the wealthy than serving the community. They would harass people for minor infractions in one part of town while ignoring rampant crime in another. People felt unheard, unseen, and unimportant. They were tired of the same old politicians making the same old empty promises. A sense of despair had settled over many parts of the city. Hope was a luxury few could afford. The daily grind was exhausting. People worked multiple jobs just to keep their heads above water. The dream of getting ahead, of building a better life for their children, felt more distant than ever. They saw the corruption, the corporate greed, and the political indifference that defined their city. They craved change, a real and meaningful shift in how Los Santos was run. They were ready for a revolution, not of violence, but of ideas. This was the Los Santos that was crying out for a hero. Not a caped crusader, but a leader who understood their struggles. Someone who wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo. Someone who would fight for the working class, the poor, and the forgotten. The political atmosphere was thick with tension and anticipation. The old guard was losing its grip. The people were restless. They were no longer willing to accept the scraps from the table of the rich. They were ready to demand their seat at the table, and they were looking for someone to lead the way. Into this charged environment stepped a new kind of political figure. His name was Marcus Thorne, and he was unlike any candidate Los Santos had ever seen. He wasn't a slick, corporate-backed politician from Vinewood. He was a community organizer from Davis, a man who had spent his life on the front lines, fighting for social justice. He spoke not in polished sound bites, but with the raw passion of someone who had lived the struggles he talked about. He didn't wear expensive suits. He wore the simple, practical clothes of a man of the people. He was one of them. Thorne's message was simple, direct, and powerful. He called it a new deal for Los Santos. He wasn't just nibbling around the edges of the problem. He was proposing a complete overhaul of the system. He promised to take on the powerful interests that had held the city captive for so long. He spoke of a Los Santos where everyone had a fair shot, not just the privileged few. His rallies weren't held in fancy convention centers, but in local parks and community halls, where he could speak directly to the people he wanted to serve. He laid out a bold vision. He promised to freeze rent increases immediately, giving families a sense of security they hadn't felt in years. He pledged to make all public transportation completely free, helping people get to work and school without the burden of bus fares. He talked about taxing the city's billionaires and largest corporations, making them finally pay their fair share to fund essential public services. This was a radical departure from the politics of the past, and it resonated deeply with a population that felt left behind and ignored. The political establishment laughed him off at first. They called him a radical, a dreamer, a socialist whose ideas were unrealistic and dangerous. The mainstream media, owned by the very corporations he promised to tax, largely ignored his campaign or portrayed him as a fringe candidate. But they underestimated the power of his message and the depth of the people's desire for change. While the establishment mocked him, the people listened. His grassroots movement grew day by day, fueled by volunteers and small-dollar donations from ordinary citizens who finally saw a glimmer of hope. One of Thorne's most talked-about proposals was his plan to address the city's food crisis. He promised to open government-owned grocery stores in every neighborhood. These stores wouldn't be for profit. They would sell staple foods at wholesale prices, ensuring that no family in Los Santos would ever have to choose between paying rent and putting food on the table. This idea was revolutionary. It directly challenged the big supermarket chains that had been price gouging residents for years. For many struggling families, this promise alone was enough to earn their vote. Then there was his plan for policing. Thorne was a vocal critic of the Los Santos Police Department. He argued that the LSPD was bloated, unaccountable, and militarized. He proposed a bold solution: defund the police. He didn't mean abolishing law enforcement entirely. Instead, he wanted to redirect a significant portion of the LSPD's massive budget into community-based programs. He wanted to fund mental health services, addiction treatment centers, youth programs, and job training. His argument was that investing in people was the best way to prevent crime in the first place. These promises painted a picture of a radically different Los Santos. It was a city where housing was a human right, not a commodity. A city where getting around wasn't a financial burden. A city where nutritious food was affordable for everyone. A city where public safety was built on community support, not just force. It was a vision that inspired millions. People began to imagine a future free from the constant stress of financial insecurity and fear. They saw a chance to build a society based on cooperation and solidarity, rather than competition and greed. The excitement was palpable. In diners, on street corners, and in online forums, the main topic of conversation was Marcus Thorne and his vision. People who had been politically disengaged for years were suddenly energized. They attended rallies, knocked on doors, and talked to their neighbors. They felt like they were part of something bigger than themselves, a historic movement to reclaim their city. The promise of a new dawn was no longer just a distant dream. It felt like a real, tangible possibility that was finally within their reach. As the sun set on Election Day, the entire city held its breath. The polls had been tight, but the momentum was undeniably with Marcus Thorne. The established political machines had thrown everything they had at him. They ran attack ads, spread misinformation, and tried to scare voters with talk of economic collapse and chaos. They warned that his socialist policies would destroy Los Santos. But the people weren't listening to the scaremongers anymore. They were listening to their hearts and their hopes for a better future. The energy in the Thorne campaign headquarters was electric. The first results started to trickle in. They came from the working-class neighborhoods of South Los Santos, from Strawberry, Davis, and Rancho. The numbers were staggering. Thorne was winning these areas by landslide margins. A cheer erupted in the campaign office, a wave of relief and joy. But the race was far from over. The wealthy districts of Rockford Hills and Vinewood Hills were still to be counted, and they were expected to vote heavily against him. The tension mounted as the night wore on, with every new precinct report swinging the balance. Then, the news channels made the call. It was a projection, but it was definitive. Marcus Thorne had done the impossible. He had overcome the money, the power, and the media to win the mayoral election. The roar that went through his headquarters was deafening. People were crying, hugging, and chanting his name. Out on the streets, the celebration began. Cars honked their horns in unison. People poured out of their homes, dancing and singing. It was a spontaneous citywide party, a release of years of pent-up frustration and a joyous embrace of a new beginning. The victory was more than just a political win. It was a cultural earthquake. It sent a shockwave through the city's elite. The billionaires in their hillside mansions and the CEOs in their downtown boardrooms were stunned into silence. They had never believed it could happen. They had always assumed their money and influence could control the outcome. But they had misjudged the will of the people. The citizens of Los Santos had spoken with one clear, powerful voice. They had rejected the old ways and embraced a future built on the principles of equality, justice, and community. The inauguration day dawned bright in Los Santos. A massive, diverse crowd gathered, eager to witness history. Marcus Thorne took the stage to thunderous applause. He took the oath, a transfer of power to the people. His address declared, "This is your victory. City Hall will be the people's house. We will measure success by the well-being of families." The crowd roared. He promised rent freezes, free transit, taxing the rich, and reimagining public safety. Let's get to work. Los Santos looked forward with optimism. Mayor Marcus Thorne wasted no time. On his first day, he arrived at City Hall by public bus, a symbolic gesture. He rolled up his sleeves and began transforming campaign promises into policy. The energy of his campaign filled the corridors of power. Thorne assembled a team of activists and community leaders, eager to dismantle unjust systems. The first 100 days were a whirlwind. Every day brought a new initiative aimed at changing lives. Thorne's approach was direct. He believed he had a mandate and was determined to deliver. The atmosphere was one of anticipation. For the first time, City Hall felt like it was working for the public good. Thorne spoke directly to residents, explaining his policies. This period was characterized by optimism. The dreams of a more equal Los Santos seemed possible. Mayor Thorne's first act was bold. He froze all residential rents citywide with Executive Order No. 1. Overnight, rent hikes stopped. Families in Vespucci Beach and La Mesa, once threatened by eviction, now had real protection. The city erupted in celebration. Relief swept through working-class neighborhoods. Landlords and real estate moguls protested, but their warnings fell on deaf ears. For the first time, Los Santos declared housing a right, not a privilege. The battle lines between people and profit were drawn. Days later, Thorne made public transit free. No fares, no barriers, just open buses and metros for all. For workers, it was an instant pay raise. For the city, a step toward equity and environmental progress. Ridership soared, communities connected, and daily life grew easier for millions. Critics worried about costs and crowding, but Thorne promised the rich would pay. The people embraced their new freedom of movement. Los Santos felt more united than ever. Thorne tackled food insecurity next, launching the People's Pantry, city-run, nonprofit grocery stores. Fresh, affordable food replaced overpriced corner stores in food deserts. Families saved money, and neighborhoods gained new community hubs. The city's direct challenge to corporate grocers forced prices down citywide. The People's Pantry became a symbol of real, tangible change. Thorne's promise, not just words, but food on every table. To fund these sweeping reforms, Thorne passed the Fair Share for Los Santos Act. Mansion taxes, progressive corporate rates, and financial transaction fees targeted the city's wealthiest. The elite fought back with PR campaigns and legal threats, but the public cheered. For the first time, the rich were asked to pay for the city's future. Thorne's message was clear. This was justice, not punishment. The city's priorities had shifted, permanently. Thorne's plan to defund the police sparked fierce debate. He proposed cutting the LSPD budget by 30%, redirecting funds to mental health, addiction services, and youth programs. Police unions and conservative media warned of chaos, but Thorne stood firm. Community groups rallied behind a new vision of public safety. The city was divided, but the conversation was finally happening. Los Santos was reimagining what safety could mean. Thorne's early months brought hope and unity to Los Santos. Rent freezes, free transit, and affordable food transformed daily life. Approval soared. The city felt vibrant and optimistic. Critics' warnings faded as real change took hold. But old powers regrouped, plotting their return. The golden age had begun, but storms were gathering on the horizon. The first tremors were felt not in South Los Santos but in Rockford Hills and Vinewood Hills. The city's wealthiest residents were making plans in response to the new mansion tax and income surcharges. For sale signs began appearing in front of opulent mansions. Private jets were booked for one-way trips to Liberty City, the Cayman Islands, or Dubai. The exodus was a calculated withdrawal of capital and influence. High-end car dealerships saw a slump in sales, and exclusive designer boutiques had empty showrooms. The silence in the hills was the first sign of a coming economic storm. They underestimated the scale of the wealth flowing out of the city's coffers, representing a hole in revenue. The exodus was not limited to individuals. The city's corporate titans, who had been targeted by the Fair Share for Los Santos Act, began to make their moves. It started with angry press releases and op-eds in the Los Santos Meteor, decrying the city's new anti-business climate. They warned that Mayor Thorne's policies would make it impossible to operate, innovate, and create jobs. These were not idle threats. Behind the scenes, in the gleaming skyscrapers of the downtown financial district, CEOs and their boards were having serious conversations about their future in Los Santos. They felt that their long-standing, cozy relationship with City Hall had been replaced by an adversarial one. The first major blow came when Badger, a massive national telecom company, announced it was relocating its operations to the neighboring state. The move would mean the loss of thousands of high-paying jobs and a massive chunk of corporate tax revenue. The company's CEO stated plainly that the city's new punitive tax structure left them no choice. Soon after, several prominent hedge funds and investment banks quietly downsized their Los Santos offices, shifting their main trading operations to other financial centers. The city that had once prided itself on being a hub for finance and technology was now watching its corporate base erode. The impact of these corporate departures was more immediate and visible. Entire floors of office buildings in downtown Los Santos began to empty out. The lunch spots and coffee shops that depended on office workers saw their customer base vanish almost overnight. the for-lease signs that were once rare in the central business district began to multiply. The city's commercial real estate market was suddenly facing a crisis. The departure of these anchor tenants created a vacuum that was not easily filled. Mayor Thorne publicly remained defiant, accusing the corporations of corporate blackmail and a lack of civic loyalty. He argued that these companies had taken billions in profits while paying minimal taxes, and their departure was a small price to pay for economic justice. He promised that new, more responsible businesses would rise to take their place. But the reality on the ground was stark. The loss of these major employers represented a serious threat to the city's economic stability. The winds of change were blowing through the corporate corridors, leaving a chilling silence in their wake. While corporations relocated, economic distress brewed in neighborhoods Mayor Thorne sought to champion. The People's Pantry provided high-quality food at incredibly low prices. However, small family-owned stores couldn't compete. They couldn't match the city's prices. These small business owners were now facing ruin. The irony was painful. The mayor was inadvertently crushing the smallest entrepreneurs. The closures started. With each closure, a neighborhood lost a local landmark. The winds of change were blowing out the lights of the beloved corner store. The Thorne administration had based its entire revolutionary platform on a simple equation: tax the rich and big corporations to pay for sweeping social programs for everyone else. It was a morally compelling and politically popular idea. However, the equation had a variable they hadn't fully accounted for. The rich and the corporations could simply leave. With the exodus from the hills and the corporate relocations, the revenue side of the city's budget began to look dramatically different from the rosy projections made just a few months earlier. The tax base was shrinking at an alarming rate. City finance officials began to sound the alarm in closed-door meetings at City Hall. The projected income from the mansion tax was falling far short as properties sat unsold or were sold at a loss. The corporate income tax revenue was plummeting as major companies vanished from the city's registry. At the same time, the expenses side of the budget was ballooning. The free transit system required massive subsidies to cover lost fare revenue and increased operational costs. The People's Pantry, while popular, was a significant and ongoing expense. The city was spending more and taking in less, a recipe for fiscal disaster. The first casualty of the budget crisis was long-term investment. Plans to repair the city's crumbling infrastructure, its roads, bridges, and water pipes, were put on indefinite hold. Funding for parks and recreation departments was slashed. The city's libraries had their budgets for new books and programs frozen. These were not the flashy, headline-grabbing programs, but they were the essential sinews that held the city together. The new expenses were crowding out the old, basic responsibilities of municipal government. The city was quickly becoming cash-strapped, forced to make difficult choices between its new promises and its existing obligations. The public was largely unaware of the looming fiscal cliff. They were still enjoying the tangible benefits of the new policies. Mayor Thorne and his team were reluctant to admit the severity of the problem, fearing it would undermine public confidence and empower their political enemies. They hoped it was a temporary situation, that the economy would stabilize and new revenue sources would emerge. But the numbers didn't lie. A massive black hole was opening up in the heart of the city's budget, and it threatened to swallow the entire socialist experiment whole. The winds of change were carrying the unmistakable sound of a financial reckoning. The People's Pantry was a beacon of hope, but its operational model had a critical flaw. By selling food at wholesale prices, it operated with razor-thin margins, relying entirely on the city's budget to cover its significant overhead: staff salaries, rent, utilities, and transportation. As the city's budget crisis deepened, the funding that kept the pantries running began to dry up. The first sign of trouble was subtle. Certain items would be out of stock for days at a time. Then, entire sections of shelves started to look sparse. The city's purchasing department was struggling to pay its suppliers on time. The problem was compounded by overwhelming demand. Since the prices were so low, there was a constant run on staple goods. The supply chain, managed by a city bureaucracy that was not experienced in the complex logistics of large-scale retail, could not keep up. Shipments were delayed, and restocking became erratic. The once gleaming, fully stocked stores began to look neglected. Shoppers who had come to rely on the pantries for their daily needs were met with empty shelves and out-of-stock signs. The promise of affordable food was becoming an empty one if the food wasn't there to be bought. Frustration began to mount among the very citizens the program was designed to help. Long lines would form outside the pantries in the morning, with people hoping to get what they needed before everything was gone. This created tension and anxiety, replacing the joy and relief that had marked the store's grand openings. The initial success of the People's Pantry had driven many private competitors out of business, so when the city-run stores failed to deliver, people in many neighborhoods had nowhere else to turn. They were left with fewer options than they had before the revolution began. This issue became a powerful symbol for critics of the Thorne administration. They pointed to the empty shelves as proof that socialist policies, however well-intentioned, inevitably lead to scarcity and failure. They argued that the government was simply incapable of running a complex enterprise like a grocery chain as efficiently as the private sector. The empty shelves were no longer just a logistical problem. They were a political catastrophe. They represented a broken promise, a tangible failure of the new system that everyone could see. The winds of change were now gusting through barren aisles, whispering of incompetence and disillusionment. The defunding of the Los Santos Police Department had a profound and immediate impact. The initial 30% cut led to a hiring freeze and a halt to equipment purchases. Many veteran LSPD officers began to leave the force. The number of officers patrolling the streets began to fall steadily, leaving behind a younger, less experienced, and increasingly demoralized police force. The Blue Retreat was underway. The LSPD's ability to respond to crime diminished. The city's crime statistics began to creep upward. The winds of change were carrying the distant but approaching siren of lawlessness. The honeymoon was officially over. The initial euphoria that had swept Los Santos after Mayor Thorne's election began to curdle into a complex mix of frustration, disappointment, and fear. The simple, elegant promises of the campaign were crashing against the hard, messy reality of governing. The unity that had defined the early days of the administration was fracturing. The whispers of discontent, once confined to the mansions of Rockford Hills, were now being heard in the working-class neighborhoods that had been Thorne's staunchest supporters. People were starting to question if they were truly better off. The conversations in diners and on buses were changing. People who had celebrated the rent freeze now worried about rising crime. Families who had cheered the People's Pantry were now frustrated by its empty shelves. Small business owners who had hoped for a better future felt abandoned and crushed. Even the free bus rides were less enjoyable when the buses were overcrowded and the streets outside felt less safe. The coalition that had elected Thorne, a diverse group united by a desire for change, was beginning to splinter as different groups felt the negative consequences of his policies in different ways. Mayor Thorne and his administration found themselves increasingly on the defensive. Their press conferences, once celebratory announcements of new programs, became tense affairs where they were forced to answer for budget shortfalls, rising crime rates, and failing services. They blamed the city's problems on sabotage by the wealthy elite and corporate greed, but these explanations began to ring hollow to citizens who were simply trying to live their daily lives. The narrative of a glorious revolution was being replaced by a more complicated story of unintended consequences and managerial incompetence. The political opposition, which had been stunned into silence by Thorne's victory, now found its voice. They saw an opportunity in the growing public discontent. They began organizing recall petitions and holding protest rallies, amplifying the voices of those who felt harmed by the new policies. The media, which had once cautiously covered the new administration, now ran sensationalist stories every night about crime, corporate flight, and government failure. The winds of change had shifted direction. They were no longer pushing the city forward with hope and optimism, but were beginning to blow back against the mayor, carrying the seeds of a powerful backlash. The initial phase of Mayor Thorne's revolution was over. The city was now entering a new, more difficult chapter, governed by the harsh law of unintended consequences. Each of the mayor's policies, designed with the intention of creating a more equitable society, had begun to spawn unforeseen and damaging side effects. The rent freeze, a policy that brought immediate relief to millions of tenants, was a prime example. Property owners, unable to raise rents to cover rising maintenance costs, simply stopped spending money on their buildings. Furthermore, developers halted all plans for new apartment construction. The policy designed to solve a housing crisis was inadvertently ensuring that the city's housing stock would slowly crumble and never grow. Similarly, the free public transit system was becoming a victim of its own success and the city's broader financial woes. Breakdowns became more frequent, leading to long delays and service disruptions. Everywhere you looked, the second-order effects were becoming apparent. The vision of a socialist paradise was being undermined by the practical, real-world fallout of its own policies. The defunding of the Los Santos Police Department was a stark reality. The steady stream of officers leaving meant the LSPD was shrinking at an unprecedented rate. Precincts felt like ghost towns. Remaining officers were stretched thin, morale was at rock bottom. This decline impacted the force's capabilities. Specialized units were disbanded or cut. The forensics lab became backlogged. The LSPD was being hollowed out, losing knowledge and proactive policing. They were becoming a reactive force. Recruitment of new officers halted. The pool of applicants dried up. This wasn't temporary, it was a demographic collapse. The police presence vanished. The social contract felt broken. The police were in retreat. This created a power vacuum. The shrinking LSPD created a power vacuum. Criminal elements noticed the lack of police patrols and slow response times. Property crime exploded, carjackings became commonplace, and storefronts were looted. Home invasions increased, and residents lived in fear. Gangs like the families Ballas and Vagos saw an opportunity to expand their territory. Turf wars erupted, and shootouts became nightly occurrences. The crime wave reached a historic high, overwhelming the police. The rising crime statistics became the terrifying reality for the people of Los Santos. The closure of small businesses began to spread throughout the city. The exploding crime rate and the departure of residents meant a smaller customer base. The vibrant main streets of Los Santos were beginning to look like ghost towns. The family-owned hardware store couldn't afford to keep replacing its smashed front window. For lease and going out of business signs became common. Each closure represented the loss of local jobs and community hubs. The economic ecosystem of the city was collapsing. The dream of a worker's paradise was turning into a nightmare for small entrepreneurs. The boarded-up storefronts were a constant reminder that something was deeply wrong with the city. The trouble was written on the face of every darkened storefront on Main Street. The city's financial situation went from bad to worse. The budget black hole that had been forming was now a gaping abyss, and the city was in a state of fiscal freefall. The exodus of wealthy taxpayers and corporations had proven to be far more damaging than the Thorne administration had ever anticipated. At the same time, the costs associated with the new social programs continued to mount, while the rising crime wave added new, unforeseen expenses, such as overtime for the remaining police and cleanup costs for vandalism. The city was effectively bankrupt, living on borrowed time and rapidly depleting its emergency reserves. This, forced the administration into a series of desperate and deeply unpopular decisions. To save money, they had to start cutting the very public services that citizens had long taken for granted. Garbage collection was reduced from twice a week to once every 2 weeks, leading to overflowing bins and unsanitary conditions on the streets. Streetlight maintenance was deferred, plunging many neighborhoods into literal darkness at night, which only further emboldened criminals. Public parks became overgrown and neglected as the city laid off its groundskeeping staff. The basic functions of a municipal government were grinding to a halt. The irony was crushing. In his quest to provide ambitious new services like free transit and wholesale food, Mayor Thorne was now failing to provide the most fundamental services that citizens expect from their city. The budgetary time bomb was exploding, and the shrapnel was hitting ordinary people the hardest. The quality of life in Los Santos was deteriorating rapidly, not just because of crime, but because of the collapse of the simple civic infrastructure that makes urban life tolerable. The city was becoming dirtier, darker, and more broken. This fiscal collapse exposed the fundamental flaw in the administration's plan. Their model was predicated on being able to take vast sums of money from one group and redistribute it to another. But they had failed to understand that the source of that money was not static. It was mobile and could flee. They had killed the golden goose, and now there were no golden eggs to pay for anything. The ticking of the budgetary time bomb was now a deafening roar in City Hall, signaling the imminent and total failure of the great socialist experiment. The trouble in Paradise was that Paradise had run out of money. The diverse coalition of voters that had swept Marcus Thorne into office was built on a shared hope for a better future. But as the situation in Los Santos deteriorated, this unity shattered. The shared hope was replaced by shared misery, and different groups began to blame each other and the mayor for their specific grievances. The bonds of solidarity that had felt so strong on Inauguration Day were broken by the harsh realities of crime, scarcity, and urban decay. The whispers of discontent had grown into loud, angry shouts of betrayal from all corners of the city. The working-class families in South Los Santos, who had been Thorne's most passionate supporters, now felt the most betrayed. They were living on the front lines of the gang wars and the crime wave. The promise of being safer through community investment felt like a cruel joke when shootouts were happening on their streets and the police never came. Their children couldn't play outside, and they lived in constant fear. They had voted for a mayor who they believed would protect them, but they now felt more vulnerable and abandoned than ever before. Their support for Thorne was evaporating in the face of this daily terror. Meanwhile, the more progressive middle-class voters who had been drawn to Thorne's ideals were also growing disillusioned. They were frustrated by the incompetence of the city government. The empty shelves at the People's Pantry, the unreliable buses, and the decaying public spaces were evidence of a government that couldn't manage its basic responsibilities. They had supported the idea of socialism in theory, but the chaotic and dysfunctional reality was not what they had signed up for. Their intellectual support for the revolution waned as the practical failures mounted. Even the city's powerful labor unions, which had been key allies, began to distance themselves from the mayor. The public sector unions were furious about the budget cuts that led to layoffs of their members, from sanitation workers to city clerks. They saw the mayor sacrificing their jobs to protect his signature and failing projects. The coalition was not just cracked, it was broken into 1,000 pieces. Thorne was now politically isolated, losing support from the left, the center, and of course, the right. The trouble in paradise had left him a mayor with no allies and a city full of angry constituents. The cumulative effect of all these problems plunged Los Santos into a state of pervasive anxiety and tension. The optimism of the early days was a distant memory, replaced by a grim sense of foreboding. The city was on edge. The social contract had been broken, and in its place was a Hobbesian struggle for survival. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. The sense of community that Thorne had hoped to foster had been replaced by a fearful, individualistic mindset. People were focused on one thing: protecting themselves and their families from the chaos swirling around them. This tension manifested in ugly ways. Road rage incidents became more common as frayed nerves snapped in traffic. Arguments on the street over minor issues would escalate quickly into physical confrontations. A siege mentality took hold. Those who could afford it invested in high-end security systems, reinforced doors, and even personal bodyguards. Neighborhood watch groups formed, but they were often little more than bands of paranoid and sometimes armed citizens, increasing the potential for tragic misunderstandings. The city was a tinderbox of fear and anger, waiting for a spark. The media narrative, both locally and nationally, now painted Los Santos as a failed state, a cautionary tale of what happens when radical socialist ideas are put into practice. The city became a national symbol of urban collapse. The stories focused relentlessly on the violence, the poverty, and the government's impotence. This constant negative portrayal only deepened the despair of the residents who were trapped in the situation, making them feel as if the whole world was watching their city die. There was no longer any hope that things might turn around. The only question was how much worse it could get. The paradise that Mayor Thorne had promised was lost. In its place was a deeply troubled city, teetering on the brink of total collapse. The economy was shattered, law and order were non-existent, and the government was broke and powerless. The citizens were scared, angry, and divided. The grand experiment in creating a more just and equal society had failed spectacularly, leaving behind a wake of destruction and human misery. The city was unraveling, and the stage was being set for an even more dramatic and drastic intervention. With the Los Santos Police Department weakened, the city's gangs seized power, establishing governance in neighborhoods like Strawberry, Davis, and Rancho. Groups like the Grove Street families and the Ballas became the new landlords, offering twisted protection at a steep price. Residents were forced to pay weekly taxes. Refusal was not an option. Those who didn't pay faced vandalism, violence, or worse. The gangs carved up the city, marking territories. Turf wars erupted, and gunfire became a nightly soundtrack. The gangs outmatched the police, becoming a conquering army. The city transformed into a nightmare run by violent gangs. The fiscal crisis led to the collapse of public spaces, what urban planners call the commons. These shared assets make city life possible. With no money for maintenance, these assets began to rot. Public parks became overgrown. Playgrounds fell into disrepair. The city's infrastructure began to fail. Deferred maintenance led to frequent main breaks. The power grid suffered from rolling blackouts. The free public transit system ground to a halt. The policy meant to connect the city now isolated the poor. This collapse had a profound psychological effect. Every overflowing trash can, every darkened street lamp was a testament to the city's demise. It fostered a deep sense of cynicism and despair. Citizens received a wasteland of shared public squalor. Chaos consumed Los Santos, creating a dramatic division. The city split, fortified enclaves for the wealthy and forsaken territories for everyone else. The affluent hired private security, creating fortresses with high walls and checkpoints. These zones became islands of order. Outside, the forsaken lacked power, water, and protection. Survival was a daily struggle, with gangs ruling the streets. This desperation highlighted the breakdown of civil society. The city's division illustrated inequality at its most extreme. Los Santos' social fabric was torn, creating an unbridgeable chasm. With the economy in shambles and the city bankrupt, official currency lost its meaning. In forsaken zones, a new informal economy rose, the barter economy. People traded goods and services directly. Gasoline, antibiotics, batteries, and ammunition became the new gold standard. Makeshift markets sprang up where people traded meager possessions. While this system allowed survival, it was inefficient and dangerous. Barter markets were targets for gangs, who would take what they wanted by force. The city had regressed. Mayor Thorne inadvertently destroyed both economies, leaving a primitive system. The city as an economic entity had ceased to exist. Where was Mayor Marcus Thorne amidst this collapse? He was a ghost in City Hall. Once a charismatic man of the people, he was now isolated. City Hall had become a fortress. His daily reality was panicked briefings about the worsening situation. The man who promised transparency was now cut off. He was a mayor in a bunker. Reports depicted a man haunted by his fallen dream, staring at maps. He had set out to cure the city's ills, but the patient was now dead. The weight of this failure was crushing. The hero had become the architect of destruction. He was the captain hiding as the ship went down. The city was unraveling and its leader was nowhere to be found. The collapse of Los Santos was no longer just a local story. It had become a non-stop national and international spectacle. News helicopters from every major network circled the skies, broadcasting shocking images of the burning, decaying city to the world. Reporters in flak jackets stood in front of gang-controlled neighborhoods, breathlessly describing the anarchy as if they were in a war zone. Los Santos had become a byword for urban failure, a living documentary of a first-world city descending into third-world chaos. The story was irresistible. The socialist utopia had become a dystopian hellscape. This intense media scrutiny put immense pressure on the state and federal governments. The governor of San Andreas had declared a state of emergency months ago, but was hesitant to send in the National Guard, fearing a bloody conflict with the heavily armed gangs. The president, watching the nightly news from his office, saw the situation not just as a domestic crisis, but as a national embarrassment. The images coming out of Los Santos undermined America's image on the world stage. A major American city had effectively seceded from the rule of law, and the government appeared powerless to stop it. The cry for help from within the city grew deafening. The few remaining community leaders, business owners, and ordinary citizens who had access to outside communication pleaded for intervention. They sent desperate emails to federal representatives and called into national talk shows, begging for the federal government to step in and restore order. They described the horror of their daily lives, the fear, the violence, and the complete absence of a functioning government. They made it clear that the city could not save itself. Its own mayor was in hiding, and its institutions had crumbled into dust. This public outcry, combined with the horrifying media coverage, created a political imperative for the president to act. The situation could no longer be ignored or left to local authorities who were clearly overwhelmed. It was a direct challenge to the authority and sovereignty of the United States government. A decision was brewing in the nation's capital, a recognition that the experiment in Los Santos had failed so completely that only a drastic outside intervention could end the nightmare. The city's unraveling had reached a point where its fate would now be decided by forces far beyond its borders. The city had reached the point of no return. Every system had failed, the economy collapsed, the government was bankrupt. Law and order was replaced by gang rule. There was no internal mechanism left to stop the downward spiral. Los Santos was a patient in the final stages of a terminal disease. The city was on life support, and someone outside the family was about to pull the plug. This final stage was marked by a complete loss of hope. People were simply trying to survive. The dream of a better Los Santos was dead. The citizens were exhausted and ready for any solution that would bring peace and stability. The city had completely unraveled, reaching a state of anarchy. The president made the decision that would close this chapter of the city's history. The failure was so total that the only remaining path was a federal takeover. The response would be swift, decisive, and military. The great socialist experiment was about to come to a definitive and dramatic end, not with a whimper, but with the rumble of tanks on the freeway. In the White House, a momentous decision was made. The president, having watched the crisis escalate, had seen enough. The situation in Los Santos was a threat to national security. The only viable option left was a direct federal intervention by the United States military. The order was drafted and signed, invoking the Insurrection Act. It allows the president to deploy troops on American soil to suppress rebellion and restore order. The order authorized a full-scale military operation to neutralize hostile elements and re-establish federal control over the city. The order was given. The gears of the American military machine began to turn, aimed at the heart of Los Santos. In the pre-dawn hours, the ground began to tremble as the gates of Fort Zancudo swung open. A formidable display of American military power emerged. A long convoy of Rhino tanks led the procession, followed by barracks transport trucks filled with soldiers. Valkyrie and Savage gunships lifted off as the federal response began. The military convoy advanced down the main Los Santos freeway like a great steel tide. Their objective was a city on their own soil. The symbols of domestic life now formed the backdrop for a full-scale military deployment. The force fanned out, establishing checkpoints, effectively sealing off the city. The helicopter gunships flew low, their presence an intimidating announcement that a new power had arrived. This was a direct and total takeover, designed to shock the city into submission. As the scale of the military presence became clear, most of the gang members retreated. The steel tide from Fort Zancudo was washing over Los Santos. The military convoy pushed into downtown Los Santos. Its destination, City Hall, Mayor Thorne's bunker. Rhino tanks rolled into the plaza as soldiers formed a cordon around the building. Helicopters circled, snipers watching. City Hall was surrounded. LSPD officers, outmatched, offered no resistance. They were swept aside. A commander demanded surrender. Inside, panic erupted. The rumble of tanks was the only argument that mattered. It was a fantasy to resist. The siege was brief. Soldiers breached the doors and began a sweep. The civilian government was being dismantled. The hunt was on for Mayor Thorne. Marcus Thorne was found in the mayoral office. The opulent chamber was dark. He peered through the drapes at the tanks and soldiers. He was a broken man, etched with exhaustion. When soldiers entered, Thorne did not resist. His last stand was a quiet surrender. The man who had risen to power was now being taken into custody. The revolution was over, its leader a prisoner. The image of the mayor being led away would become the defining photograph of this saga. He left behind a city in ruins, a legacy of chaos. The mayor's last stand was a quiet end to a tumultuous chapter. With Mayor Thorne in custody, the military transitioned to occupation and administration. A senior military general was appointed interim governor, placing the city under martial law. The American flag was raised over City Hall, symbolizing direct federal management, ending the era of socialist rule. The priority was restoring basic functions. Military patrols swept the city, breaking the power of gangs. Raids seized weapons and detained leaders. Order returned. The Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA addressed the humanitarian crisis, restoring essential services. Food, water, and medical supplies were distributed. Residents felt relief, resignation, and apprehension. Their experiment in self-governance had failed. Los Santos was now a federal protectorate, its future determined by officials in a distant capital. The city was saved, but its autonomy was gone. The story of Mayor Marcus Thorne and his socialist revolution in Los Santos is a modern tragedy. It is the story of a dream, born from genuine grievances and noble intentions, that soured into a waking nightmare. The autopsy of this dream reveals a fatal flaw not in the diagnosis, but in the prescribed cure. Thorne correctly identified the diseases crippling his city: rampant inequality, corporate greed, and a political system that ignored the suffering of its most vulnerable citizens. This powerful moral argument formed the basis of his coalition, uniting disparate groups under a single banner of hope. However, the dream was killed by a fatal dose of ideological purity, mixed with a staggering naivety about the complexities of human nature and economics. They caused the bakers, the investors, the entrepreneurs, the corporations, to pack up their ovens and leave town entirely, leaving everyone with nothing but crumbs. The autopsy shows a clear cause of death, a beautiful dream that was utterly disconnected from the unforgiving laws of reality. The federal intervention halted the chaos, but couldn't erase the deep scars left by the failed utopian experiment. Los Santos became a patchwork of decay. The city's infrastructure was severely neglected. The city was physically broken, and the economic scars ran deep. Los Santos lost its reputation as a hub. The small business sector had been decimated. Perhaps the most profound scars were the social and psychological ones. The period of collapse had shattered the bonds of trust. The trauma of gang rule and violence would linger for decades. Furthermore, the experiment left behind a scar of political disillusionment, fostering cynicism toward politics. Rising from the ashes of the Los Santos catastrophe are several hard-learned lessons. Good intentions aren't enough. Noble goals pursued recklessly can worsen problems. A better society requires respecting complexity and understanding unintended consequences. Wealth isn't a static resource, but a product of human action. Hostile environments drive it away. Order and the rule of law are fundamental. Dismantling public safety without alternatives creates a violent power vacuum. Law and order are the bedrock of progress. Los Santos is a cautionary tale about ideological extremism. Moral righteousness can blind leaders to devastating impacts. A healthy society needs balance and questioning of assumptions. Absolute power leads to disaster, leaving only ashes. Los Santos is now under federal control. Military occupation is focused on stabilization. Clearing rubble and re-establishing order is a monumental task. Economic recovery will be a long and arduous process. It will be a slow and difficult sell to wary corporations. Reconstruction and security businesses will likely be the first to return. Rebuilding a diverse economy will take years of careful planning. Political recovery will be just as challenging. A new generation of leaders will need to emerge. Ultimately, the long road to recovery depends on the people of Los Santos themselves. The road ahead is a marathon of healing and reconstruction. The saga of Mayor Thorne has thrown the very identity of Los Santos into question. For decades, the city saw itself as the world capital of dreams. That identity has been shattered. The world now sees Los Santos as a cautionary tale of urban collapse, tarnished by images of violence, poverty, and failure. The citizens themselves are now forced to grapple with this identity crisis. The experience has exposed the deep fault lines that always existed beneath the glossy surface. The gap between the rich and the poor was not an invention of Marcus Thorne. It must now confront the truth of its divisions. The future identity of Los Santos hangs in this balance, a city still searching for what it truly wants to be. Years from now, when Los Santos has been rebuilt, the story of Marcus Thorne will still cast a long shadow. It will be a ghost that haunts the city's politics, a memory that informs every debate. His name will be invoked as either a boogeyman or a tragic martyr. The socialist experiment will have permanently changed the conversation, forcing issues of inequality to the forefront. The promise Thorne made will also endure, even if his methods are forever discredited. The shadow of this era will serve as a permanent warning of the dangers of hubris. For the citizens, it will be a reminder of their own power to bring about incredible change and unleash unimaginable chaos. In the end, it is a timeless story about the human condition and our search for a better world. The shadow of Marcus Thorne's promise will linger, a reminder of how quickly a dream can descend into dystopia.